If you're drinking or using something addictively, like, or compulsively, like when you're binging, or regular use of something, have you noticed how hard it is to stop? Um, why is that? When you have a craving, when there's an addiction present and you have a strong craving, everything that you know about addiction, everything you know about your history, and any decisions that you've made not to drink or to moderate, they essentially go out the window in that moment. There's some brain research on this, which essentially certain aspects of the brain get shut down. Those aspects that have made executive decisions around things like, I'm going to stay sober, that kind of thinking, or I'm only going to drink on weekends, that kind of executive decision will get shut down in the moment that something emotional is coming up or something is happening emotionally or psychologically that might even be unconscious. We call those drivers. So, trauma is a driver towards addiction. That's science. Self-esteem issues, deficiency story, driver. That's also well documented. Shame is a driver. Emotional repression or drivers is a driver. These things are what's really driving our addiction under the surface, along with any genetic predisposition. But it's essentially a genetic predisposition and then a bunch of emotional stuff. So, in the moment when, even if you've made the executive decision, I'm not going to drink, in the moment that the driver gets activated or something is happening in your emotional body, the mind remembers that what helps with that is to go watch porn or drink alcohol or something. And in that moment, it gets blinded, and the only thing that it can see is using that thing. So even if you want to remember the value of staying sober in that moment, it's very difficult. You might even play a tug of war in your mind a little bit, but notice how the compulsion often wins out. So you end up drinking even when you don't want to, or continuing to use even when you don't want to. How many times do you have to see this happening to recognize that something different has to change? Like that this recovery can't ultimately be about decisions that you have made to behave a certain way, because those decisions get shut down in the moment of a craving or the resurgence of a trauma or something, some trigger. How many times do you have to see this before you recognize something new has to happen here because my decisions aren't working out? There are people all over recovery programs, some of whom have many years clean and sober. Let's talk about them secondly, the ones that have managed to not drink or use for a number of years. By and large, though, I would say the majority of people in recovery, according to the statistics, actually experience recurring use or recurring relapsing and an inability to accumulate any long clean time. Maybe they'll get a year, maybe a couple of months, sometimes not even 24 hours, sometimes a couple of years. But for a large majority of people that I saw in those rooms, and again, according to the statistics, those executive decisions that we make to remain sober get shut down in the moment that a true craving comes up. So, how many times are you going to be in that kind of recovery program, recognizing this, that something isn't potentially being seen here, something isn't being unhooked from, and so this is why you're experiencing the chronic relapsing or inability to stay sober? I discovered this in my own experience because for about 3 years, I was pretty much the poster child for Narcotics Anonymous. People actually called me that in Indiana because I soaked in all of the concepts and everything about 12 step and made a decision not to use painkillers along with other things. And then, after a year of being clean, I found myself with painkillers in my hand, about to swallow about 8 of them. Not for suicide, to get high. I washed those or flushed those down the toilet, but that was an eye opener to me because I, again, had become the poster child for 12 step. And yet here I was, the poster child, the one that was doing everything that they suggested, like They suggested 90 meetings in 90 days. I went to 120. They suggested getting involved in service work. I went and became the chairman of the boards of the service organizations. They said, become a sponsor, have a sponsor, and become one. And I did all that. And there I was at the end of 1 year in the midst of a compulsion where all of that fell by the wayside. It's like in the moment of the craving, none of that I had learned cognitively about recovery could help me. And I mean, you could say, well, I flushed it down the toilet, but the compulsion was so strong that I understood the nature of this thing much more when I saw that moment happening. And in that moment, I realized that something new has to happen for me, because I realized that you can fill your head up with all sorts of concepts and ideas and beliefs and programs around addiction and recovery. And then before you know it, you're drinking again every day. Before you know it, you're swallowing pills, you're shooting up heroin, you're back to porn. There's so much that's unconscious and on autopilot in those moments, right? And if you cannot transcend what you can't see. That's what I say all the time. So if there are drivers like trauma in your system, which is usually repressed, you don't even see it. That's driving that. How can you overcome the addiction when you can't even see the driver? You're not fully conscious of the thing that's driving it. It's like being on autopilot. So in the moment that I was wanting to take those pills, I didn't know that trauma was driving that. I didn't know that my emotional body was driving it. I learned that later. But my question to you is, how can you expect to truly recover when you're not, or even transcend your addiction, I should say, if you don't even know what's driving it? And I don't mean intellectually. It's not enough to intellectually know, because that's part of the brain that just thinks it knows things. And that part gets shut down when you have a strong craving or a trigger. It's not enough to know things intellectually. There has to be some direct experience, in my view, for an authentic recovery, has to be some direct experience of seeing in your own experience what it is you're believing, what stories you're telling, what pain you hold on to, what trauma is unresolved. And until you see that, again, not intellectually, but see it in your experience, in awareness, so that you can unhook from it, I think most people are going to have a difficult time with real recovery, being so unconscious to so much. So what we're doing with the Kill Bee inquiries is we've created, Dan McClintock and I have created kind of a separate thing called a new model of recovery. And we're about to roll that out. We've been planning this for some time. So we're going to this private space. I'm taking the work to a private space. I've announced that. I'd like you to follow. But one of the things we want to do in that private space is to create a community of people recovering via inquiry, via the new model, which means becoming awake to the drivers, becoming awake to and unhooking from the emotional drivers, which then can have a profound effect on the compulsion itself, because that's what's driving it. If that's something that you're interested in, or maybe you've already been interested in it, but you just need better tools, or maybe this conversation is the first time you've ever thought of it this way, that there are things driving your addiction and you're not getting at them, and then you hear me say, hey, I've got some tools that get at that. Either way, come and join us. This way of recovery is very different than other forms of recovery. In other forms of recovery, the tendency is put the thing down and don't use anything else. Not all recovery programs are like this, but put this down and don't use anything else, and then just stay clean and try to work on yourself. But a lot of this stuff is unconscious, guys. Like working on yourself through the conscious mind of what you can know and feel in your conscious mind doesn't get to a lot of the stuff that's unconscious and held in the body. Trauma, we know from science, is held in the body. There's even talk of cellular memory. Like literally that every aspect of our inner body contains information from the past. And that information is usually painful when it comes to this, or scary, and that's driving the addiction. So if you can hear me, just knowing what science is out there telling us, we've got to change the way we're recovering because it needs to match science. If it doesn't, then it's like we're just shooting in the dark, like we're shooting and looking at things that may not have any evidentiary basis for our addiction. But when we follow science and we follow our direct experience, both of those things reveal to us that trauma drives it, that deficiency stories and shame drive it. So when it finally dawns on you, that's what's going on, you're going to want to assess your recovery program and find out, is there any aspect of it that's somatic based? So is there any aspect of your recovery program that is taking you from awareness into your inner body to discover these old programs and stories, emotions, feelings, and learning how to unhook from them skillfully? That's what we're doing in a new model of recovery. So the recovery is very different in that we don't just say stop using everything. We don't actually tell you one way or the other whether to continue using. What we emphasize is doing inquiry on the addiction on a regular basis, including right before when you have the compulsion, and then even after if you use something. And what that does is, as releasing the drivers, unhooking from the drivers, creates a change in your inner body. So the body becomes, instead of contracted and dense, tight, painful, it becomes increasingly open and translucent and light and empty. And this is not spiritual woo-woo. This is what actually happens in your direct experience. And as the body becomes more translucent, it's not holding on to that old programming from your childhood that drives you to addiction. So then it becomes easier to say no. Because when the somatic is cleared up, when the traumas are resolved or mostly resolved, the compulsion is much less. And then your relationship to the thing changes simply because your body doesn't crave that in the same way. And that is not an executive decision not to use. That is not a mind decision not to use. It comes directly from the clarity of the body. So when you feel that clarity, it becomes easier to say, no, I don't need that. I don't really even want that. And then some new pattern of behavior can show up. But in the meantime, as you're getting clear of those drivers, you may or may not have to use something because trauma is there. And what we say is, do whatever you have to do. We're not going to encourage you one way or the other, but we want to introduce this topic of harm reduction because it doesn't get talked about enough in some of the old recovery programs. People have come to the Killaby Center addicted to heroin. They have to work out their trauma. That is not an overnight thing. But as they're working it out, maybe they make a decision to go from heroin to marijuana. That reduces the harm. Heroin at least brings with it the risk of overdose and damage to the system, lots of other issues, whereas marijuana might not be as damaging. So the person may make a decision to reduce harm while continuing to get some relief on some of the symptoms of trauma while they're dismantling and investigating the trauma to let go of it. So you see, there's more than one way to recover. And what we found is that even in the old recovery programs, people are already doing harm reduction, but it often isn't talked about. So in other words, when people go into a 12-step program, they might give up drugs and alcohol, but then the addiction to sugar comes to the forefront as a substitute, or the addiction to porn. And for a while, those may actually be less harmful. But if the recovery program is just focused on you not doing your primary drug of choice, like, okay, I'm not drinking today, and it doesn't make room in its context for what it is that you're doing as a substitute, you might not put two and two together. You might not recognize you're already doing harm reduction by substituting something else that's less harmful. But here's the thing that's so helpful. Even the thing that you're substituting with, so let's say you move from heroin to porn, that often contains the same drivers. The same drivers are driving addiction in all of its forms. So if you continue to use porn, for example, or something that's less harmful, you can inquire on the drivers as they arise. See that for the porn? You may not even be doing harm reduction. Maybe you're someone who says, I can't stop drinking, even to do this work. Well, then maybe you'll find a way to do the work in the midst of that, even on the cravings for alcohol. Your path is your path. It's just that with New Model, we're wide open. Like we're open to seeing different ways of recovering here. And you'll find your own way with our help. We'll all give you our experience with this. But the main thing I want to tell you before I invite you to this new space around New Model, again, we're going to create a space for all of the Kill the Bee inquiries. So you can come to that space and work on anything, really. But the part that works on New Model, we're going to invite you there, but only if you're at a place in your life where you see what it is I'm saying, like that makes sense to you. You resonate with what I'm saying, and you feel a readiness to really begin to do that deeper work. And you want to learn the work so that you can do that. Those are the folks that we're interested in inviting to a New Model. So if that's you, follow me. Go to my main Facebook page. At the very top, there's a post with a 1 star in a black sky. There's a link there to another Facebook account. Go to that link and request to be friends with me, because that's where we're at right now. We're going to move all of that into some private space on the internet. So come join us now so that you can join us where we land. And New Model is one of the things that we're about to roll out. And this is exciting because we've been doing this quietly with people with some amazing transformations. Now we want to bring it out to you and let you become a part of this. So if you're ready and interested, follow me.